Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Vafa, aka the Redisty Shredder. Thank you for joining me. Today, we're going to be covering recording bass guitars for your home metal recordings. This tutorial is part of a series, so I'm assuming you've already caught up and you're able to record tracks and you understand the terminology I'm going to use. If you haven't, be sure to check out my previous tutorials and also be sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss on future tutorials. The agenda for today is we're going to be covering some general bass guitar recording tips. We're going to be going over the signal chain for recording bass, some tips for tracking your bass, tones using the TSE BOD, which are free, tones using EZMix by TuneTrack, which are not free. And just a quick note, if you don't own a bass guitar, I'm going to show you how to create bass for your music in a future tutorial. However, this tutorial will still apply because the techniques we're going to use to dial in the tones will still come in handy. And just a quick disclaimer, as I've said before, I'm not a sound engineer, I'm not an expert, I'm not even a professional musician, I'm not even a bass player, I'm a guitar player who just plays bass for my projects. So with that out of the way, let's move on to the lesson. So some general bass guitar recording tips. I like to think of the bass as sort of like a large, clean guitar that you mostly just play single root notes on. So this means that it's important to play consistently, and this applies to the amount of force you use on the strings, both for your picking hand and for your fretting hands. It's important to consistently play parts if they have hammer-ons or pull-offs, whether they do or whether they don't. These small details might be able to be something you gloss over if you're playing rhythm guitar, but you should not for bass. And since it's sort of like a clean guitar, obviously the strings are going to have a large effect on your tone, so change your strings. Okay, next tip I have for you is to consider writing unique bass lines. Rather than just always following the rhythm guitars all the time, you should consider changing up your bass line and creating a wholly unique bass line. And this applies to both the rhythm and the actual note choice. Of course, you can combine both. A simple way to just create a unique bass line purely in terms of rhythm is to follow the drums, in particular the kick drum and the snare drum instead of the guitars. And then for varying notes, this is a lot more obvious. Just write something unique and just make sure it sounds good, so that usually means staying in key. And I'll demonstrate an example of both of these ideas later on in this video. Okay, next tip is to think about your non-fretting hand style. So your tone will vary depending on if you use a pick, if you use fingers, or if you slap. So I use a pick almost all the time. It tends to have a very loud and consistent high-end attack. If you use fingers, it's a softer tone with less attack. And if you slap, you have a more percussive, high-end popping kind of attack. There's also fretless basses, but I don't own a fretless bass, nor have I ever created a tone for one. So for those reasons, I'm just going to completely skip over fretless bass. However, if I had to guess, I would assume that it sounds better with a tone that's more high-end with less distortion. Next is to think about your actual fretting hand. So different strings and neck positions are going to have a different effect on your tone. So depending on which strings you play and where you play those notes on the neck, it's going to have a pretty big effect on your tone. This is true for guitar, but especially true for bass. So for instance, lower notes on the lower strings are going to have less of a pick attack than the notes played on higher strings or higher up on the fretboard. And of course for metal, we're mostly going to be playing notes on the lower strings. If you're like me, you're a guitarist that's not familiar with the finer details of dialing in a tone for bass as compared to guitar. However, I believe that for bass tones, you have a lot more flexibility and you can choose a wider variety of bass tones compared to guitar tones. So here are three general bass tone ideas. The first is what I call the pure low end, which is for this type of tone, the attack of each individual note is not necessarily audible. You wouldn't necessarily be able to pick out the bass independently when in an entire mix compared to the guitars. It's where the bass track is just kind of in the background and it provides just low end. If you were to mute the bass in this sort of tone, what you'd end up with is a song with no bass, no low end at all. So the second style of bass tone is what I call just the heavily distorted tone, which is where you still have somewhat of a distinctly audible bass that's distinct from the guitars, but it still kind of tends to blend in with the guitars. It's because it has just a ton of distortion on it. And the third, which is my favorite, the bright, clean, or clanky style tone, which is where you have a bass guitar that's very distinctly audible from the guitars. There's a lot of pick attack and high end, maybe some light distortion. You still need to make sure that that provides enough low end though for your mix, but that's my preferred style. Okay, so let's start off talking about the effects. So first you can start off with a noise gate and an overdrive, just like a rhythm guitar. And since I said earlier, I like to think of the bass guitar as sort of like a clean guitar, you may want to consider adding a compressor to the beginning of your signal chain because bass performances tend to have a pretty wide dynamic range in terms of volume. Personally, I've never felt the need to do this just because I play the bass consistently hard. Next stage in the signal chain is going to be an amp head followed by a cabinet simulation with IRs, just like a rhythm guitar, followed up with EQ and whatever additional effects you want to add on the end. I've found that there's a lot more flexibility when it comes to bass signal chains compared to guitar. I feel like you can omit any of these stages as you see fit, so just use your ears and experiment. Just like with rhythm guitars, you want to make sure you don't have any clipping at any stage. Okay, so for tracking bass, I like to track one single centered bass guitar. However, it's also possible to do what's called double tracking bass. So to do this, what you do is record one performance and then copy and paste that performance into a separate track and process them separately. This is different than dual tracking guitars where you record two performances and hard pan each track. The idea behind this technique is to just have each bass track focus on one or the other purpose. So one would be purely for low end and one would be for higher end, and you could add distortion to one or both. I personally don't do this because I feel like you run into the risk of having a lot of phasing issues, and also it's just more effects, it's more tracks to have to deal with. I've always been happy with the tones I get from just one single centered bass track, so I don't think this is necessary, and I don't use it. Okay, so here's an example of a free bass tone from my original song. It's called Upholder of Benevolent Dementia. Let's just take a listen. All right, now let's listen to that bass soloed. All right, now let's listen to the dry, pure dry bass tone. Okay, so let's look at the effects used to build this tone. So first we've got this Acon Digital denoise effect. This is basically just a noise filter to clean up some background noise. The short version is I used to live in a building that was very old and had a lot of wiring issues. It had a lot of wireless interference issues. So I had to use this effect to just clean up the bass tone. However, this shouldn't be an issue for most people. Since this effect doesn't have any actual bearing on the bass tone itself, we'll just ignore it. Okay, so next we have the TSE BOD, which is just an overdrive pedal for bass. It's free, it sounds great, and it just adds some chunkiness to your tone. So let's listen to that soloed. All right, next we have the bass amp and cabinet. I'm actually just using a stock Logic effect here. It simulates both the amp and the cabinet itself. If you don't use Logic, you can just go search for a free amp sim, and you can use NAT-IR, which we covered in the previous lesson, and find some bass IRs. This one has basically the most effect on the tone, of course, and after this, the tone is basically finished. So let's just take a listen to that. Okay, and last I have this EQ, which basically just cleans up some inaudible frequencies. So let's just take a quick listen with it on. Okay, so next I have for you two examples of tones that are not free. This is from my original song called Eternal War. So this song actually has two bass tracks that are completely separate. It's not the double tracking method I talked about earlier. There's just two distinct different parts in the song. There's the main part of the song, and then there's kind of like a quieter mellow section at the end. So the advantage of paying for your tones using EZMix or some other paid solution is that you get a tone that's made by an actual professional audio engineer. And so for that reason, I tend to use EZMix a lot these days, especially for my bass tones. Okay, let's just take a quick listen to the main tone. Now let's listen to that soloed. All right, and let's just listen to the dry track. Okay, Okay, so the bass tone for this track is the Bass Clean preset from the Modern Metal EZMix expansion pack. So this tone is nice and bright and clean with a heavy pick attack style that I like. However, on its own, it doesn't have enough low-end bass for me, so let's just listen to it soloed. So to get that low end, I have yet another EZMix effect on here. This is an insert effect, and this one is included with EZMix. It's just called Bass 3. So let's listen to them together. Okay, and lastly, just a regular EQ. This is just to clean up some inaudible frequencies. Okay, now in the full mix again. Okay, quick side note, as you can hear during this section, the guitars are playing some octaves and then some seventh chords, but the bass is playing a riff that just syncs up with the kick drum. This is an example of what I mentioned earlier when I said you should be creative with your bass performances and make unique bass lines rather than just always playing the root note of whatever the guitars are doing. So next I've got the second bass tone for this track. This is just a second tone that's for a more mellow section of the song. I'm calling it bass mellow here. So let's just take a quick listen in the full mix. All right, okay, so as you can see for this tone, this one's more of the kind of pure low end tone. It's a much softer tone than the previous one I showed you. And for this one, again, I'm using EZMix, and the preset is plucked bass combo. It comes with EZMix, and it's just for pure low end. Just like in the last section, this bass line doesn't match up with the guitars. It actually matches up with the kick drum and the snare drum, and at the very end there's a little bit of its own little melody line. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on recording bass guitar. Hopefully it's been useful even though I'm not a bass player. Please let me know what you think, and if you don't have access to a bass guitar, as I mentioned earlier, I will cover how to create a bass track for your music even without a bass guitar in a future tutorial. We can use software instruments, and you can even use a guitar. But please let me know if you have any questions, or if you just want to say hi, or if you have anything you wanted to let me know about or ask me to cover, just let me know. All right, thank you, and please subscribe for more. And as always, thank you for watching.